Hello everybody and welcome to a very special hobby cheating video. So this is going to be a paint review. Ultimately, there are a wide range of miniature paints available in the market. I'm going to take you through most of the major brands and kind of show you how they work, talk about their pros and cons. As I switch between paints, I'm going to throw up a quick slide so you can kind of see, I sort of summarize the pros and cons. In the end, the ultimate advice for this that I would have, here's the summary statement. Try a lot of different brands of paints. People often ask the question of what is the best brand of paint. That's a rough question to ask because there is no arguably best. There are some that perform worse under certain situations, but in the reality, it's more about finding the paint that aligns and performs with the way you paint. Okay, so if you tend to rely on glazes or you tend to use layering more, you tend to, however you tend to paint, you want to find the paint that aligns best with that style. So there we go. So this is going to be kind of an overview of how they work. Things I'm not going to touch on in this video. I am not going to cover paint lines that focus specifically on weathering. So AK Interactive and Secret Weapon and stuff like that. I might do those as a future video where I just focus across all the weathering and pigment lines because there's a lot of different stuff out there specifically for that. So those will be left to the side. We're only doing acrylic paints, so we're not going to touch on alcohol-based, enamel, anything like that. And finally, I'm not going to touch on P3, not because I have anything against them, just because I haven't used them and I don't own anything outside of their washes. I will say that I do own their inks and shades, and you know, I can give you a quick, easy review of those. I like them; they're good. There you go. As to the regular paints, I'm sorry if you're looking for P3 information. I don't have it. It's not one I've been able to experiment with. So, but what we're going to cover here is Games Workshop, Vallejo, Reaper, Army Painter, Badger Minitaire, Darkstar, Scale 75, and Warcolours. Each of them are time-coded below, so if you look down in the description, you'll see a time code where I jump to each one of those paints. So if there's a particular one you want to see, you can do that, or you can watch the whole video. So, without any further ado, let's get right into it. And so up first, we're going to tackle, of course, Games Workshop. Alright, so we begin our paint review with, of course, something that I'm sure most people are familiar with, which is Games Workshop. Technically Citadel paint, that's actually what it is. So I'm sure most people are familiar, especially if you got into gaming through Warhammer or something similar like that. You're probably familiar with the paints. So, you saw the pros and cons on the sheet, but I mean, the pros are fairly obvious. They have an absolutely massive range of different paints available, technical paints and, you know, all sorts of different things, supporting products, airbrush paints. There's, you know, their base things come in, the regular acrylic paints have base, layer, shades, sort of that dries, all the kind of things you would use for their basic paint style. These are great for beginners, to be completely honest, because you're going to tend to use a palette less, so you can go straight out of the pot. You don't really know what you're doing when you start. I mean, to be fair, we all didn't know what we were doing at some point in time, which is fine. And the idea that there is a system to this, of you apply your base, you apply your layers, you wash with your shades, you dry brush with the dries, like that's very helpful to a new person. And I've had several people who were starting out in the hobby tell me that, because they didn't otherwise know what does it mean to thin your paint. I don't even know with what. How do I thin my paint? You know, like it's just, there are sort of basic things we all kind of tend to take for granted when you get along into the hobby. These answer a lot of the questions. So when we look at GW paints and kind of the style that they are, they're a fairly liquid paint. That is, by that I simply mean they will run pretty smoothly. You do still, the general usage would still have you thinning them. This is obviously one of the layer paints, Warpstone Glow, and people tend to like this particular color. That's another advantage. They have a pretty massive range of colors available. Obviously, they also work as to what it says on the box, right? You can sort of every time you buy a Warhammer product, there's going to be paint instructions. Now, you'll notice when I didn't thin the paint at all, I just took it straight out of the pot and put it on there, that my coverage with something like the layer is not great. If you thin them, they get pretty thin, pretty fast, and pretty weak. Now, that being said, these paints tend to be more favorable to the beginner that's going to be wanting to thin their paints less, that's going to get just some good water paint and want to achieve the effect they're looking for in the very famous, two thin coats. But you can see that, building up over something like a dark black is going to be tough with, say, your standard acrylic paint. Ultimately, with the Games Workshop paints, the real problem with them for me, the reason I wouldn't use them commonly, and I tend to stay away from them, we'll move into the personal opinion section, is they're a little bit relatively higher cost. You're getting 12 milliliters for, usually around $4. But that, by the standards of miniature paint, that's fairly expensive. I do not like the pots. The pots tend to get clogged up with paint down in there, and then don't close properly, tend to dry out. Because if you want to, they're not really easy to mix because they're in the pots to get the same ratios every time. You can't control drops and stuff like that. So ultimately, they're a perfectly fine paint set. And if you want to follow, the colors on the back of the GW box, they can be great to work with. And there are plenty of painters who achieve absolutely stunning effects with Citadel paints. Okay? Which is true for just about everything I'm going to cover today. Let me just say that. There are great painters who are going to say that every paint I cover today is one that they use. So, there you go. Now, but for me, don't like the pots. Little bit high cost comparatively, and ultimately they don't thin very effectively, and that's a problem for me personally because my paint style tends to be one where I work in a lot of glazes and things of that nature, and these don't have a very high pigment density, so when you thin them, they tend to fall apart pretty easily or go glossy or other problems. Now, that being said, the standout from their line, as I'm sure many know, is their shades. I will come out fully supporting things like the shades, their technical line. This is liquid green stuff, which is very useful, but also, say, like Blood for the Blood God, Typhus Corrosion. I still to this day use these shades and use the technical paints quite a lot. I find them to be absolutely fantastic for a ton of different uses. Even if you don't normally wash your entire model, as I almost never do, I find that these are great for even thinning other paints. They're wonderful for that because they're very medium heavy, and so they work great as just thinner. When you want to, say, take a color and desaturate it, move it toward brown a little, you can take a paint from any range, mix in a little Agrax, beautiful. So, shades and technicals are the standouts for me. The base and the layer, like I said, leave a little to be desired, but can be good. You can see the coverage here that I got is perhaps a bit lacking over, say, dark black. Though, again, if you just do a couple thin coats with just some water in your brush, you'll tend to have success with them. So, overall, awesome paints for beginners. Great because they instruct people. There you go. That's my thoughts on GW paints, or Citadel, as it were. All right, so we'll be back next up covering another big name, which is Vallejo. All right, so now we continue on with Vallejo, and Vallejo holds the distinction of probably having the largest paint range in existence. I'm not sure about that, but I don't know how anyone else could beat them. Vallejo just has an outrageous amount of paints, all spread across a bunch of different lines. So you saw the slide. Basic advantage, they're reasonably costed. Their range is just beyond massive. They have the best metallics on the market. They're easy to work in various different styles. So they're really great paints, and they tend to be a lot of painters' workhorse paints. There are a lot of people who stand behind Vallejo, who back it. They are a company that basically makes paint, so they're not bound to a particular game or gaming company, which is nice. But they have a huge range to a lot of different purposes. So let's kind of take a look. The standard two in the brush range are model color and game color. Now, these tend to be fairly similar. There is a slight difference in the medium of the game color, but for most people, they're going to perform pretty much the same. These are the brush ready paints. They are thicker. They are heavier. They're going to look and feel. First of all, they're in dropper bottles, as you can see, and you get 17 milliliters in a dropper bottle. So we remember that was compared to 12 milliliters for your Citadel, and they tend to be, depending on where you get it, either cheaper than a Citadel pot or about the same cost. So here we're just going to put a little bit of this flat red. You can see it's a little more, it's quite a liquid paint again, just like we saw with the Games Workshop paint. If I take this down and water it just a little, the model color and the game color tend to be pretty thick, and I'm using a transparent color here. This is, you know, a flat red, so this is a pretty naturally transparent color. And you can see you get pretty decent coverage, about the same as you got out of green. Obviously, and this is something I should have stated before, your coverage is really going to vary by the color of the paint, even by the batch. One thing I will say with Citadel is they tend to be very consistent. One color is going to, or sorry, one batch of a particular color is going to perform about the same as any other. That can be a downside with Vallejo, is that sometimes you just get a bad batch. I've had many people say that. Vallejo glazes quite well. You can see how I thinned that way down, and look how consistent that still was. Now, the downside is that when you thin out Vallejo too much, it tends to get quite glossy. The nature of the pigment in it means that it will spread out. There's not quite enough pigment in it, and so it'll spread out, and you'll start to get either this kind of effect where I've thinned it too much and now it's starting to run, or it'll sort of go glossy on you because there's just medium and you haven't put anything in there. Now, fortunately, Vallejo has the answer to that in things like glaze medium and thinner medium, both of which are just additional mediums to kind of make them hold together. And I found that when you're working in very thin glazes of Vallejo paints, that is highly recommended. The other types of Vallejo paints are your Model Air and Game Air, both of which are simply, as you can imagine, the airbrush-ready versions of the previous selection. The difference here being that they are very, very, very much thinner. There's our downside to the dropper bottle, by the way, in live action, is that dropper bottles can tend to clog up a little, but our old friend, the paperclip, easily handles that problem. So as you can see just how much more that runs. These are thinner, but they're pretty airbrush ready, generally just them with a drop or two of thinner medium, and you're good to go. But these, you can brush paint with them. I like brush painting with the airbrush paints, but they are going to require more coverage. These do glaze pretty well. The pigment is ground very fine because it's airbrush ready. So I happen to like both the Model Air and Game Air a lot. And again, both of these have absolutely massive ranges to the colors themselves. A couple other items of note in the Vallejo range are their Vallejo Metal Color, which is simply, bar none, the best steel paint on the market. So if you're looking to achieve a steel color, this whole range, this is actually steel, but any silver metal, they have a range of about 16 of these in various shades of steel. These are period, the best metal paints on the market. Okay? I can defend that if you want. I have a whole product review dedicated to it. I have tried, at this point, 18 different metal paints across the market. Nothing performs like this in acrylic. There are other paints that are better that are alcohol or enamel based, but this is the best acrylic metal paint on the market. Useful other things, their surface primer is something I stand behind. The Vallejo surface primer is an acrylic polyurethane mix. Has a very, very easy spray through your airbrush and tends to harden and really, I can't think of maybe once in the history of doing it where I've actually rubbed primer off or something like that. Once it's on, it's on. I'd stand behind the Vallejo surface primer. Finally, last interesting item, they have the Vallejo Extra Opaques. These actually come out of the Game Color line. These are sort of slightly heavier than one of the bases in the Citadel line. I rather like these, as these will cover anything with this color, in even thinned, in more or less one coat. They're fantastic for laying down an undershade. If you need to, if you've painted a model and a color's wrong, or you need to get a new undershade down to get something neutral, these can be an absolute lifesaver. I tend to use the heavy blue-gray and their brown constantly to color shift or things around where I need to. So, yeah, the Vallejo range is really something that I would recommend to a lot of painters who are looking for sort of a second paint set. The dropper bottles make it easy to work with, to do mixes, though there are an absolutely massive range of colors that they have available. Little tip, these are often carried at Hobby Lobby, and Hobby Lobby has like a daily 40% off coupon or something you can get. And so if you grab that coupon, you can kind of go in, and my co-host on Warhammer Weekly was well known for going in every day after work with his 40% off coupon, and every day he just bought one paint at 40% off. And after about 2 months, he had a heck of a selection of paints available. So took a little while, but he got there. I do like Vallejo as a workhorse paint. I think it's great. I think it's easy to work with in a large variety of styles. I think the price is generally right. They do sometimes have a satin finish if you're not careful, especially some of the colors. You tend to get slightly varied qualities of batches occasionally, and some of the colors are just flat bad. So there can be some experimentation with the line. That's to be expected when they make 500 or 600 different paints. Maybe more now. It's probably up around like 700 or 800 if you figure in all the different things they do. But I think in the end, these are a great choice. So that's Vallejo. Next up, we're talking Reaper. Okay, so next up we've got Reaper paints. So Reaper is a pretty popular line of paints, obviously tied to not a line of miniatures, not in such a way where it's tightly tied to the game, but nonetheless, they also make a great line of both metal and PVC-based figs in the Bones line. So the benefits of the Reaper paints, where you saw on the slide, they've got a very large range. They have good paint sets. So that is to say, like, they have nice packs that contain various sets of paint for doing various purposes. They have good beginner sets. They have a very nice, like, tri-color selection where they'll give you, like, a mid-tone, a highlight, and a shade color. So they're great for working in layers, especially for newer painters, because, again, much like with the GW system, they can be really nice because you sort of see what's a good combination for a base color, a highlight, and a shade color, usually for terms of layering, but you can go other directions. There are several different washes and inks and such in the line, but their two most notable lines are just the Master Series paint and then the MSP Master Series Paint HD. The HD being notated because it's high-density pigment, as it says right there. So several times I've mentioned that some of the paint lines have a lower density pigment, which makes them harder to glaze with and things like that without turning glossy. It has to do with basically the science of paint and the way that the medium is at a chemical level. Medium basically looks... At a chemical level, medium basically is a bunch of sort of hexagons. or octagons or whatever. And what you're trying to have happen as this sort of spreads out over your miniature, you're trying to capture a little piece of pigment in each one of these. When you start getting blank hexes, you get glossiness. So, at any rate, this one, the HD line I actually rather like because it is high density pigment, glazes well, stuff like that. Also has pretty good coverage if you use it thicker. Let's take a look at these paints. So I have here a nice little couple colors, Gothic Crimson and Twilight Purple. Their paints have all, sort of exotic names, fun names like that. As you can see, oops, didn't shake that enough. That's my fault. Their paints as well come in dropper bottles. Cost-wise, they're pretty average. They usually, if you buy them direct from Reaper, they're about $3.50. The problem is they put theirs in ounces, a half ounce, which breaks down to about 14.5 milliliters. So they're kind of in between GW and, there we go. In between GW and Vallejo. They are a pretty liquid paint. That is to say, they run pretty easy. They're pretty wet paints, which is nice. You don't have to do an incredible amount of thinning with them. This is a very transparent color I picked here, but I'll get out the HD color just so you can kind of see the difference. There you go. You can see already, look how much more dense the color is on that one than the crimson. Now, it's not a completely fair comparison because red, especially deep crimsons, are usually quite transparent colors, but you can still see, even in just the way that spreads out, how much thicker that is than that one. Okay? So, the Reaper lines take glazing or thinning pretty well. It doesn't take a great amount of water to get some good results. You can see here, smooths down pretty evenly. Not really much of an issue. Now, overall, I like the Reaper paints a great deal. I know there are several great painters that rely quite heavily on Reaper paints. They have several in-house painters that do all of their figs in Reaper paints. And, generally you can get them to a nice matte finish. They don't tend to have any kind of satinness to them, which I find to be very attractive. They thin well, especially the HD line I find is actually quite great. The HD line is a little more limited on the colors available. The normal Master Series line is really their main paint line, and this is quite massive in its range of colors available. But the HD line I do actually highly recommend. I think it's a really solid line of paints. I think you can get some great effects with it. And overall, Reaper is a great paint. If you're not going to go up to Vallejo, I think that moving on from a GW or something like that, especially for a newer painter, Reaper can be a great second paint. It lets you work with mixes rather easy because you can control your drops. You get a fair amount for the money. They have a really wide selection of colors. As I mentioned, they have the triple sets of colors, the like 3-packs with built-in sort of highlight and shade colors, which make sort of working with your miniatures, especially when you don't have your sort of your color theory completely nailed, makes it a lot easier, especially for newer painters. But you can achieve great effects with them all the way up into any level of skill. So I think Reaper overall is a very solid line of paints. They've been making them for a long time. They are all mixed to a very consistent level of quality. I don't see a lot of variation in them. Any bottle of Twilight Purple or whatever that you buy is going to probably be basically the same color, have basically the same mix, consistency, and quality, which I find to be quite attractive. So overall, Reaper's a pretty good deal. You don't get quite as much, but what you do get is of pretty high value. So there you go. That's Reaper. Next up, we are going to talk about Army Painter. Okay, so Army Painter. Army Painter is a interesting range of paints that has been up and coming in kind of the last couple of years. In general, they're meant to be akin to and have compatibility to Games Workshop's line. They largely match it, especially with a lot of their color names. You can kind of see like this is Angel Green, which is quite obviously a reference to Dark Angel Green. So, that's kind of the idea of what you're going to get out of it. And it does have, one of the things they claim is that it has good matching to it. They also have a full line of tones or inks, kind of shades. So they have, you'll see like strong and medium tone and stuff like that. All these tend to be sort of brown tones. They also have flesh tones, and you can see here, like blue inks, blue tones, stuff like that. These are obviously much like inks or shades in how they perform. They actually perform much closer to shades than to inks, though that does vary some based on the actual color. Some are I found some to be a little more pigment rich than others, and so they tend to go on a little stronger. What I'll say about Army Painter is they tend to be fairly low cost. They tend to have a fairly limited range. There's just not a lot of options in the Army Painter line. That is to say, they don't have a huge. You're not going to find, anything like the three we've looked at already, who are all notable for having massive ranges of paints. GW, Vallejo, and Reaper all have these absolutely ridiculous ranges of paints. Now, the first thing I'll say about Army Painter that you'll notice is how this didn't spread out like the Reaper. It's a naturally slightly thicker paint. Not hugely so, but you saw how the Reaper ran. This is much more akin to a Vallejo model color and performs a lot like it. I think they might actually be... The bottles are very similar. I don't know if they're actually mixed in the same place and just labeled differently. I couldn't honestly tell you. I could see that happening. Like, the bottles are very, very similar. And their performance is very, very similar, to be completely honest. They tend to have pretty reasonable coverage. They tend to thin okay and have a pretty valid number of uses. I would call them a fairly middle-of-the-road paint. They, much like Vallejo, if you glaze them too thin, they will get somewhat glossy because of the pigment density. My biggest problems with Army Painter are their metallics, which I find to be very, very weak. Like, their pigment is huge in them, and their metallics, I think, are utter... I don't think they're very good. I'll say it that way. The standouts in the Army Painter line, for me, are definitely the tones, especially the strong and medium tone. I find these to be unbelievably useful. A lot of people compare the strong tone to old Devlin Mud, I think it was, the old sort of Liquid Talent. I don't know if that's true. I didn't use enough Devlin Mud to really form a good comparison, though I've heard it frequently enough from people who did to believe that it's at least close. What I will say about the strong tone is I use this quite consistently. It has a wonderful... It's not going to show up on this paper because obviously you really need like something with texture to really make it show up. But you can see the color of it. It's a sort of brown-black shade. It performs a lot like a shade. It's very thin. It easily does run into cracks and crevices and recesses. It's darker than say something like an Agrax Earthshade, but it has a lot more, I found, control. You can sort of thin it and void blend it quite easily. It's going to not work great on this paper since this is very glossy paper that everything soaks into. But, very non-glossy paper. But on the whole, I would say if you're going to pick up anything from the Army Painter range, look into like the strong and medium tone. They're the real standouts. For me, the paint itself, it's more or less a low-cost near Vallejo replacement. If you're looking for a couple of stand-in colors for model color and you want to save a tiny amount of money and you don't have a Hobby Lobby, sure, why not? I don't find the actual regular range incredibly compelling. I think they're acceptable. As I said, they're a perfectly acceptable middle-of-the-road paint. I'm sure you can achieve great effects with them. I don't think there's anything bad about them. I just don't think there's anything that stands out about them. Army Painter overall, if you've got it, it's perfectly fine to supplement. Works well with Model Color. Tends to perform much the same as Vallejo Model Color. And the big standout, like I said, is those strong tones, medium tones. Those are pretty great. I would recommend picking those up and integrating them into your painting routines. All right, so that is Army Painter. Next up, we're going to talk about a little bit unusual. We're going to go into some unusual ones, and we're going to talk about Badger Minitaire. Right, so now we're going to talk about maybe a slightly more unusual paint line that people might not be as familiar with, and that is Badger Minitaire. Obviously, made by Badger, who makes airbrushes, some pretty great airbrushes. This is airbrush ready miniature paint. Now, what that means is obviously it's already pre-thinned. You can run it. I say straight through the airbrush, though I would always recommend thinning everything you put in your airbrush, though a couple drops of thinner, at most 1 or 2, and this is ready to rock and roll. They do not have a huge range to these. There's about, I think, 90 colors total in the range. That being said, they do have some great tones. This one being one of my particular favorite, Troll Hide, which the blue I think is named for the... I think they called it Troll Hide to make it match to the Hordes, Privateer Press's Hordes Trolls. I like these colors. The other notable line within Badger Minitaire is their Ghost Tint line. This being perhaps one of my favorite paints of all time, the Plasma Fluid. These are tint colors, and I'll show you how they work, but effectively they're transparent colors made for tinting, not for actual coverage. As you can see, you get an absolutely massive bottle. So this is 1 fluid ounce, 30 milliliters. Those aren't exactly equivalent things, but let's just say that works out okay. You can see that they're fairly thin because they're ready for airbrush. So they pretty much, you don't need to really water your paint very much to get them going if you're talking about normal brush painting, and they will brush paint without issue. I haven't had really any problem there. They'll be relatively under control. They don't really run on you or anything like that. They've got some nice tones in them. The real great advantage, or one of the not the real, but one of the great advantages to this paint is if you happen to go to a convention that Badger is at, say Adepticon or Nova or Gen Con or anything like that, you can buy their entire starter set, which is, I think it's 18 paints. Maybe 12. Maybe it's 12. But anyways, you get a bunch of them for $15. It's a pretty stupidly good deal. And if you buy you can get them and the Ghost Tint, the entire Ghost Tint range, both for $15 each. So $30 for the set, which is just an outrageously good deal for a dozen massive bottles of paint. Individually, I know the War Store carries these, and you can find them for about $3 from there. So they're a good deal. You can see they glaze pretty well, no issue. Went right into an easy thin glaze. Didn't have to fight it at all. And that's just all these glazes I'm doing just by adding water. I'm not getting any more clever than that. So the plasma fluid, the Ghost Tints in general, being a particular favorite. Oh, sorry. That's my still closed plasma fluid. Yes, I have backup bottles of this. It really is my favorite color in the universe. There we go. Oh, didn't need that much, but that's okay. So you can see that this is a much thinner paint. It's extremely liquid. I mean, you can see how that's running right there through the channels that I make. Okay, this is meant to simply cover over other colors, and you can still see that shade underneath. It has really awesome effects, especially when put through an airbrush. The plasma fluid is a great way to do some fantastic effects. The ghost tints in general are a great way to do some fantastic effects, such as colored metals, or if you just want to color shift something down. Say you've got say you're doing some basic zenithal priming and you want to turn something into a pretty electric blue that really pops. These will do that. They do have a bit of a glossy finish when they shoot straight through the airbrush or when they're brushed on. So if you want to get a straight matte finish out of a ghost tint, you need to go back afterward with some Tester's dull coat or something like that. But that'll knock the shine right out of them. I've never had problems with that. These will mix with other paints without issue. I've mixed both the ghost tints and the regular Badger Minitaire acrylic paints with other brands of paints on multiple occasions. No issues there. So for me, the standout is their basic paint set and the ghost tint set. If you can pick those up, like I said, at a convention for $30, you get an outrageous amount of paint for your airbrush or for brush work for a very low cost. And they're high quality. The ghost tints themselves, especially if you have an airbrush, you should be looking into these because what you're going to be able to achieve with them is just so much fun. I couldn't recommend them enough. So the rest of the line beyond that, they have, like I said, it's not a huge line of paints. Once you've got those basics in, you could kind of expand if you saw some other colors from there that you liked. They are very reasonably costed at, like I said, even retail. Outside of the bundle pack, you can get these big bottles for about $3 a piece. So for high-quality airbrush paints, it's a pretty good deal. So that's Badger Minitaire. Check them out. Might be something you hadn't seen yet. And like I said, especially if you're doing some airbrush work, give it a shot. I think you'll like it. Next up, we're going to go for another sort of dark horse, something newer. We're going to talk about Darkstar, specifically their Molten Metals line. Back in a moment. Alright, so next up is a much smaller paint range, but a very interesting one, and that is Darkstar, which specifically basically only makes metal paints, but I think they're worth talking about. Because they're a really unique sort of paint range. So Darkstar specifically has this range of molten metals, is what they're called. They're all made in the UK. They come in very interesting dropper bottles, as you can see. They have a wide range of metals, about 24 different metallic colors. They have a massive number of golds and silvers. I like them specifically for their gold line. As you can see, here's one of the sort of 3 packs you can get from them. Much like Reaper with the matte paints and the highlights and the shade color, Darkstar does much the same thing, but for metallic golds. So this little pack right here has the Royal Gold as the midtone, Classic as the highlight, and Regency as the shadow. These come with agitators in the bottles, like heavy agitators, which I like. I don't know if you can hear that. Like super heavy agitators in these bottles. Love that. More people who manufacture metal paints need to do that, because metal paint really requires a large amount of like shaking and stuff to flow well. And so I like the fact that they thought ahead and did that. It means that you usually get a pretty smooth gold out of them. Their metallic pigment is relatively small. Their finish is pretty shiny, as you can see there. Now, I'm not, as with most metallic paints, you do really need to use a, like a base, an undershade underneath of, say, brown or something like that, because, you know, when I try to put gold like this, you can see this suffers from the standard situation of most gold paints of having pretty bad coverage with just a single coat. Like, not much happened there. That's not unusual. In general, you know, you have to undershade gold. What I like about them isn't their coverage. I find their coverage to be average at best. What I do like about them, though, is when you undershade properly and you apply the golds, they do have a wonderfully rich color. And they have a wide range of gold tints that sort of aren't really available anywhere else. Like this Regency Gold is a pretty great example of that, where it's this, you can see that it's this very unusual sort of dark almost antiqued gold. And they have a bunch of different options like this. Just wonderful little interesting shades of gold. So if you're looking for some other ranges of gold paints outside of, say, the sort of standard gold, I guess is what you'd think of. Darkstar is definitely somebody to look at. Wonderfully bright finish, very bright metallics. The cost is quite reasonable. The only problem is you do have to order them from the UK. They're, as far as I know, over in the United States, they're only available to order directly from Darkstar. There could be somebody else who has it available I'm not aware of. But that means you've got to deal with currency conversion into GBP, and you have to, wait for it to come through shipping and all that. That being said, they're pretty worth it. When I ordered these, they were shipped to me really fast. So I was very impressed. So full kudos to Darkstar. They turned this order around zip quick. I don't know if I ordered lots of stuff from the UK, and these came as fast or faster than anything I've ever ordered. So thought that was really great. So lots of interesting colors there. If you're looking for unusual metallic shades, gold shades, I think they're definitely a company to check into. Like I said, as per usual with these, you still want to make sure you're doing all your appropriate undershading with browns or anything else that you would normally undershade gold with. But you can get some really, really great shine out of the final colors here that can make these golds something truly unique for your army and its colors. So check them out. That's Darkstar. Okay. Like I said, they don't make any paints beyond the metallics. So there you go. Next up, we're going to touch on Scale 75, something that gets asked about a lot because there's been a lot of hay made over Scale 75, and we're going to get into it. All right, so Scale 75. This has come up so often recently in a lot of different Facebook discussions and stuff like that. Scale 75, you saw the pros and cons I just listed on the page. The basic advantage of Scale 75 is a few things. There's a couple reasons why painters love Scale 75. Number one, extremely high pigment density. So these things will really, really spread out well. They'll convert into glazes well. They have very rich volumes of color, which is, makes it easier to sort of build things up. They have a hyper matte finish. That's sort of their claim to fame. And it's absolutely true. This paint, no matter how thin, I have never had it be anything but matte. And I've worked these into very, very thin glazes. And that's because of the pigment density. They also have very interesting sets to their range. Like they have a sort of non-metallic metal gray set. So it kind of contains all the paint you would need to do gray non-metallic metal, theoretically. So they tend to have 8 paint sets. They are more expensive. In general, these paints are 8 for between $32 and $38, depending on the range. And they come in 3. There are basically 3 different types, primary types. They sort of have introduced like this sort of historical line recently, but I haven't really got a chance to play with that. The two primaries are the normal Scale 75 paints, which look like this, and then their fantasy and game line. The fantasy, and there is a real difference between these, as we're going to see. The other element they have I want to point out is Scale Color also makes what they call their ink intensity set. It's 8 inks. A side note to the main paints we're talking about, but these are my favorite inks on the market, period. For enriching your colors, for adding filters, for just doing what they're meant to do. For instance, this is Intense Wood, which, aside from having the funniest name in the history of paints, also is magic. Because if you put this over some properly zenithal material, you basically get wood with one coat. As an easy example, here's something I was working on earlier. Let's see if that can come through. It's kind of got a shadow there. Apologize. There we go. And you can see that that's basically one coat of that. Like, I did some undershading to make all that stand out. You can see how much like wood that looks. So, the ink intensity set, if nothing else, I'm going to tell you right now, is my real recommendation with these, beyond everything else. Now, let's talk about the difference between the Scale 75 and the Fantasy and Games line. These are sort of, and I'll openly admit my bias, Scale 75 is maybe some of my favorite paints, but they are not newbie friendly. I would not recommend, if you're a newer painter, that you just jump into these. First things first, they separate pretty heavily. So you want to make sure that you have a good agitator in there. You have to add the agitator. You also, when they come to you, they will come sealed. These are not open. You have to puncture the top yourself. And if you don't do that and you try to push your paint out, you're going to pop the top off and shoot a bunch of paint out. So make sure you puncture it. I add agitators. My agitators are very simple. I cut up old pewter models that I am never going to use, and I put little chunks of them down in here. You could also use, glass beads that are meant to be agitators, something like that. But I like something heavy for my scale paints. There are companies that make stainless steel balls. Don't put anything in that's completely ferrous or it will rust. The real advantage to Scale 75 is, in addition to the matte finish, is that because of the medium they blend really, really well. They also do things like void blending quite well. You can really get in there and move things. Again, this paper is terrible for this purpose, but you can really get in there. Even after the paint tends to have a longer working time, so you can really get in there and work with it for quite a while. As you notice, it's quite thick paint. And so if I lay it on there with just a wet brush, its coverage is pretty freaking strong, right? Now, but at the same time, I can also thin it quite easily because of that high pigment, and just get a very easy, gentle glaze out of this. Because of the longer working time, it's quite easy to blend two different colors in the range, because they'll stay sort of wet on the miniature slightly, and so you can easily match the two colors together, do some quick wet blending. They take to that kind of technique. They take to things like loaded brush blending quite easily, stuff like that. Especially wet blending. Now, the Fantasy and Games line, if you're just looking to get into Scale 75, I would highly recommend the Fantasy and Games line. The first thing I'll say is the colors tend to be a little more fantastical, more gamey. They're brighter. They tend to have a little more... They're not muted. They tend to be much more saturated colors. There we go. That's what I'm trying to say. So, for example, this is maybe one of my favorite paint colors in their entire range. Bloodfest Crimson. I can't get enough of this color. Has a wonderful... You can see that these are a little thinner. They're a little more liquid. They have a little more medium in them. And just look at how rich that is. Like, that is an unbelievably rich magenta color. Like, the volume on that compared to, say, the magenta that I pulled out over here in the Vallejo, which was also a crimson color. The difference here is striking, right? Once again, these will blend super easy. There's no difference in the actual other performance of the Fantasy and Games line. They will still blend very easy. They will still glaze very easy. They will still dry completely matte. They just tend to be a little more liquid and a little easier to work with for people who don't just like to put paint on the miniature and then push it around, which is one thing I'll say. Some people, I know there are several high-skilled painters who the way they tend to work is they'll sort of put paint onto the miniature and then they kind of just tend to push it from there to where they want to go. Scale 75 is an excellent way to do that. They're almost where they almost use the miniature as their palette to a point. But you can see how those come together. All in all, I like Scale 75 a lot. They are more expensive, but I do think that if you're looking for, if your paint style is, say, something like the French style of Rackham or something like that, if you're really trying to force some smooth blends and you like a sort of wet blending or you like glazing, and you're not afraid of the learning curve, these can be an excellent, excellent paint. If you're a brand new painter, I would highly recommend you stay away, just because there is an extra learning curve to them. It's not as obvious how to use them, and so I would say that you probably want to stick with, some of our over here paints to start out with, and then, or maybe experiment with just a little bit of this, grab the ink intensity set, and go from there. You can find the Scale 75 in the States off their main retailer, which is, I think, out of Dallas. I know that they're also carried by the Michigan Toy Soldier and by Hangar 18 Miniatures also carries them. So, one more paint range to talk about, and it is one of my newest favorites, and I don't think a lot of people know about it, and that is a shame, because it is great. So our final paint we're going to talk about is Warcolours. Back in a moment. All right, our final paint we're going to review today is Warcolours. Warcolours is in the world of craft beers and small batch, sort of artisanal products being made. Warcolours fits that bill. They are all made and mixed by a gentleman out of Crete, the tiny island in the Mediterranean. They are a very, very interesting paint range that I have really come to love. So I'm going to slide in some of the turquoise range here. This is not the whole range. Let me move this to the side for just a moment and bring this up. So you can see how they're labeled. There's lots of interesting things about this. These are all made sort of with no showiness to it, no funny names, nothing like that. So turquoise 1, turquoise 2, turquoise 3, turquoise 4. There's also a 5 and 6, and then a transparent turquoise. They get darker as you go along. You'll see there's an opacity rating on every one of them. Over the last year, he has added a huge amount to this range. When he started, it was a fairly small range of just these basic paints. He has now expanded to metallics, to inks, to what else has he added recently? All sorts of other like glazed medium and thinner medium and flow improvers and stuff like that. But also to a line of base paints, which are thicker and have higher coverage, as well as a very fun set called like the 1988 paint set or something like that, which replicates sort of the original basic paint set you got back in the 80s with Games Workshop models, if you remember the all like super saturated, a red, a yellow, a green, and so on and so forth. So if you want to paint like it's 1989 again, he's got a set of paints for you. The Warcolours paint are pretty fantastic. The first thing I'll say is that they all come with a little bit of they have a great design. The cap is very unique if you look at it. Okay, because of this sort of unusual design, they tend to you saw that like earlier I had one of the Vallejo dropper bottles clog up on me. These don't do that, because what happens is when I let go, it tends to just suck the paint back down in. You can actually see it happening. Okay, so you don't tend to get that paint dry on the edge. Now, you'll notice this is not at all a runny paint, right? There's no liquid, there's no movement, it's not running around. This uses a gel medium, which produces some interesting effects. Like you can see, I can actually make little, right? Like I can actually create verticality in the paint. It still mixes with water without issue, so you can still thin it like normal. But it, much like with the Scale 75, because of this, it's sort of more gel nature. It's great for putting on the miniature and kind of pushing it around. Because the gel, instead of the normal medium, it has, again, a longer drying time, making it easier to work with, to blend, so you can create smoother blends. Because of the way these are numbered, You can also pretty easily, know what your next shade color up or down is, obviously. So there's not really any problem with that. I really like this range a great deal. It's, as I said, they have a range specifically meant for better coverage. So their basic line is more akin to, say, like the layer line from GW in terms of its coverage capability. These will thin out to a glaze without really any kind of issue. They actually take it rather well. You can see how when I get just a little water in there, look at how well that flows now, right? So all of a sudden I have a very liquid paint that's just will free flow quite wonderfully. It gives you a great amount of control. The medium that he uses is really fantastic. It responds well with water, dries pretty rock solid. It's not quite as matte as Scale 75, but I will say it's pretty darn close. The cost on these is also absolutely fantastic. You can get a great deal on these paints, even with shipping from Crete. These are 15 milliliter bottles. It's about the same as a Reaper bottle, but it is considerably cheaper, especially in the sets. He has really wonderful package deals on the larger sets. I know several people who have just gone all in and bought the whole big, massive set of several hundred colors and been very happy with it. I'm not telling you should or shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that, in my experience, people have generally been pretty happy with these paints. To me, these are I save them for last because they're really up and coming as one of my absolute favorite paints to work with. They have a wonderful range of colors. He's adding sort of new products and new options all the time. I haven't had anything that I haven't liked from them yet, with one notable exception, which is the metallics. As per normal, most paints, I don't like the metallics. The flakes, the pigment is too big. They don't really, they just don't look realistically like metal enough. I cannot recommend all the basic line, the inks, the acrylic paints enough. This, as a side note, when you order the basic color sets, he has bundle sets aligned to both a range of colors. So, for example, you can order just the turquoise range, which comes with a white, the full range of turquoises, and then a black. But he also has sets aligned to purpose. So, for example, he has like the fire set, which comes with, a range of red, yellow, oranges, and stuff like that to make fire. This white, the Warcolours white, because of the gel medium, is maybe my favorite white I have ever used. I use a lot of white paints. Like right here sitting next to me right now, I have 3 different white paints that I cycle between often. But this is my go-to. Because it's a gel medium, it doesn't get chalky. If you've ever used white paint and had it chalk up on you, it's not impossible. White largely goes chalky because of the pigment that's used to do white paint. But that being said, because of the medium here, this counteracts that to some degree. So this is much less likely to chalk on you. It's great when you need to mix in white for a highlight or something, especially for doing, say, a non-metallic metal effect or something like that. It's fantastic for loaded brush. Because the gel, if you have a thin glaze in the body of your brush, and then you just touch that tip into this gel, it will wonderfully flow and mix and give you a great result with loaded brush. So if you're a fan of the loaded brush technique, Warcolours White, cannot recommend it enough. It just is perfect for that task. It is a dream for that task. I know that sounds silly to focus in on that one small thing, but as somebody who does a lot of loaded brush to do non-metallic metal, it has made my life much better. So maybe if you're doing the same thing, it would help you too. So there you go. That's sort of all the paints that I use regularly and can effectively review. I'm sorry, like I said, I couldn't do P3. I'll probably do weathering paints in a separate review. In the end, what I really want to drive home is that none of these paints I've talked about are bad. And I don't want you to think of any of paint in terms of good or bad, but I want it in general. What I want you to think of is is it good for the way that I paint, right? And is it good for where I am in my progression as a miniature painter? You know, because I think that that's a much more important thing to understand and to find the paint that best suits your style and your current sort of, level of skill. And I don't mean that with any insult. I just mean we all began somewhere and we're all moving along our hobby journey together. Find the paint that's going to do the best work for you. There's nothing wrong with it. So if you're not as super confident with, you're picking your right shade colors and your highlight colors, then look at something like a GW or a Reaper or something like that where you have that guided direction. And then over time, branch out. Try some of these other paints. See what you like. As your style develops, keep trying new things and see what you love. Because of the way I've broken this up modularly, I'll probably update this video over time with additional paints. So if there's another paint review after this, I've done that. Hello in the future, by the way. But otherwise, check them out. I'll include, as I said, timestamps down below for each one of these reviews. I'll also include links out to various locations if there are things like to Badger, Minitaire, Site, Darkstar, Scale 75, Warcolours, some of these more unusual things so you know where you can go to find them. I'll throw everything like that down below, so check out the links in the description. Hope you enjoyed this very much. Give it a share if you have somebody else who has questions about paint or the way it performs. In the end, I hope everybody finds a paint that they enjoy using and that gives them the results they want. That's obviously the goal of this video. Give it a like if you liked it. Subscribe for more hobby cheating in the future. And as always, we'll see you next time.